Hello everyone, my name is Parker, and today I'm going to be trying something a little bit different today. I want to start giving informal documentaries on stories that I personally find extremely interesting and intriguing. Today I'll be going over the life story of a Japanese man escaping prisons in World War II. This is the story of Yoshie Shiratori and his extraordinary ability to escape from any situation using his intelligence and natural abilities. This is the story of the Japanese Houdini. Now, a few of the details are likely exaggerated, but I'm going to be doing my best to try to keep everything as straight and accurate as possible. Born in 1907 in Aomori Prefecture, Japan, Yoshie Shiratori lived through an era of transformation coming out of World War II when he was just 11 years old. Though little is documented about his early life, he would later have a memorial at the Abashiri Prison Museum. When he was 2 years old, his father passed away, and his mother, dealing with the emotional strain, walked out. This really hurt his developmental growth, and this can be seen throughout his early life. After he got older, he began to catch crabs after failing to open up a tofu shop. He turned to gambling, and he started to gamble his money away, increasing his debt even further, driving him deeper into a pit that he was digging for himself. In order to fund his gambling addiction, he turned to thievery, and he robbed just enough to keep himself alive. Due to the nature of his character, the police believed him to be the prime suspect in the murder of a woman. The name of the woman is never mentioned in any documents, but Shiratori always pleaded that he was never responsible for the murder. Shiratori claimed that the murder of the woman was most likely pinned on him by a gang that he owed money to due to his gambling addictions. In 1936, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, thus beginning his extraordinary journey. An important thing to note during this time period is that the prison system in Japan was extremely harsh and treated all of the prisoners that were sentenced poorly. There are thousands of accounts of the cruelty that has occurred in the prison system. It was extremely common to starve, beat, degrade, or torture the prisoners for something as simple as they felt like it. Throughout this story, you'll be able to see how cruel the system has become. One belief that Shiratori had throughout his entire life is that he could reform and change the system so that all the inmates were treated fairly. Now, Shiratori had just been sentenced to Aomori prison, and he had already began to think of ways he could escape. He carefully observed his environment and started to note down the guards' rotations and noticed all the weaknesses inside the system in Aomori prison. The guards would make rounds every 15 minutes, and he would time when the guards had made a full rotation and had been switched out for a new set of guards. So how did he escape? Well, in the 1930s, it was extremely common for the Japanese people to use wooden buckets to clean themselves when they went to have a shower. These buckets would usually have steel retaining wires that would go around them. He took off the wires of this bucket, and he would hide them for later use. He removed these wires from the bucket by wearing them down by bending them back and forth until they had pried apart. Luckily for Shiratori, he had already had experience and he knew how to pick locks, so using his new retaining wire that he had just reformed into a lockpick and a tensioning tool, he knew that he would be able to get out of the locks that were on his jail cell. And as simple as that, in June of 1936 at 5 a.m., he picked the locks on his door cell and he escaped through the ceiling at 5 a.m. The skill it takes to pick a lock backwards under the threat of torture if he is caught with tools that were not made for its intended use is nothing short of remarkable. His first escape had just been executed cleanly into precision, and he was slipped into the night undetected. This will be a common theme, where Yoshie Shiratori will make a perfect and precise plan to escape his cells or his prison, and all the people around him try to estimate them. I don't want to say underestimate, because one of the escapes that he has later on in this story is so impressive that this is what he's known for, and the reason he got the memorial. In order to increase the amount of time that he had to escape before the guards noticed, he had pulled up the boards underneath his futon and placed them underneath his sheets, so that it appeared as though there were a body underneath them. At 5:45 a.m., the guards made their next set of rounds, and at 5:45, when they checked on Shiratori, they had looked into a cell, and due to it being dark, they believed that he was still there. Even with the rounds being every 15 minutes, it wasn't until several hours later, when they were having roll call, that they had noticed that Yoshie Shiratori had now escaped into thin air. Now all the guards started to raise alert for the Japanese prison system, saying that they had now just had one escapee and they were on the loose. Although escapes were uncommon at the time, it was not impossible for this to happen, as this had happened in the past at this prison. During his brief time on the run, he primarily hid in rural areas, but his freedom was short-lived. He was caught trying to steal medical supplies at a local hospital. Despite being caught, he was marked as a person of high risk because of his nature as being able to escape from prisons and picking locks. Once recaptured, he was sent back to prison, and this time he would be under stricter security. After only 3 days of freedom before he was caught, Yoshie Shiratori was now sentenced again to life in prison. On a side note, I don't understand why he was now sentenced to life in prison, whereas he was previously convicted of murder of the woman in the past, and he was sentenced to death. This seems kind of like a loophole in the system to where if you want to get away with murder and just spend your life in prison, even though the conditions are poor, all you have to do is escape a prison. Anyways, he remained undeterred. He was sentenced to Akita prison, which would have stricter security and would increase safety measures so that he would not escape a second time. He would be constantly placed in solitary confinement whenever he was not doing forced hard labor. This was done to eliminate the amount of interactions he had with the people around him, so that they couldn't bring him supplies or anything like that. And in addition to being in that solitary confinement state, they would also have routine check-ins. With the guards now on high alert, Shiratori was under constant surveillance to make sure that he could not plan anything. They constantly beat down Shiratori and forced him to wear thin garments that would not protect him from the harsh prison winters that were occurring in Japan. Now, there was a silver lining for Shiratori, and there was a prison guard named Kobayashi, and he took pity on Shiratori. And this is because not only was he constantly beaten down, he felt bad for this prison system as well. And there are no records of him ever laying his hands on Shiratori. And later on, Shiratori, after, he escapes this prison, would later go to Kobayashi and turn to his help. Remember, Yoshie Shiratori can have only a life that can be described as truly unfortunate. His dad died when he was 2 years old. His mom walked out of his life shortly after. He then tried to run an honest life as a tofu shop owner, which fell through. Then after that, he tried to catch crabs for a living, which also didn't work. As a final result, he tried to turn to gambling, which only increased his debt even further, and he had to begin borrowing money from loan sharks. After doing all of this, he was now sentenced to be tortured in the prisons of Japan. Anyways, back to the main topic of Akita prison. To further increase the security that they had on him, they changed out the locks that he had to be specialized locks that were more complex than the previous ones. These would have more pins and higher security measures. They also did another safety precaution, which was to keep him handcuffed at all times. The floors of Akita prison were made from concrete, and the walls and the cells of his prison were specifically designed to prevent anyone from escaping. These jail cells were specifically for people who had already escaped in the past and were deemed high risk. It had smooth walls made of copper and wood, and there was only a small skylight in the ceiling that could be used as natural ventilation. Finally, if that wasn't enough, he would be routinely strip searched to ensure that he was not hiding any wires or any materials that he had gained throughout his couple of months stay in prison. Shiratori observed that the cell's air vent as well as the wood surrounding the air vent were starting to degrade and rot. He would sneak around in between shifts and under the cover of night to pry away the wood and to loosen up the vent that was on the ceiling. As you can imagine, since he had no supplies, this took several months, but this did have the nice benefit of learning how to climb the unclimbable walls. Like in a movie, under the cover of a dark, stormy night, he had made his escape. He picked his handcuffs with a wire that had somehow been secretly hidden away from all the guards, and it is unknown as to how he actually obtained the wire. Some people claim that there are two theories. The first one is that he also obtained the wire the same way that he did in the first prison in Aomori, which is stealing the retaining wire around a wooden bucket. The second one is that Kobayashi decided that enough was enough and he decided to hand him the wire himself. After picking the locks, he pried open the vent and snuck out onto the roof. There are records of a guard that was underneath him saying that he could hear footsteps from below. And this leads me to think that he had like a real life Skyrim moment where he heard footsteps on the roof and he goes, must have been the wind. On June 14th, 1942, he had now escaped his second prison. In 1942, this is 2 years into World War II, and the country is at war with the Allied powers, and Japan has now been on high alert. Propaganda of spies are now a hot common topic across Japan, and this is because a couple months prior, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese naval fleet decided to bomb Pearl Harbor, which forced America to enter World War II, and now they were constantly at war with Japan. The story behind the bombing of Pearl Harbor is an extremely fascinating story because there are so many things that could have been prevented, and I have my own conspiracy as to what happened. I think personally that the United States knew about it beforehand and they used the bombing of Pearl Harbor as an excuse to enter World War II. One example of why I think this is because during one of the early mornings around Pearl Harbor, they found a Japanese U-boat that had been caught in the nets of the system days before the attack. And there are also reports of the Japanese saying that they were going to attack Pearl Harbor on a specific day. And with all that being said, they decided to ignore the information and not act upon it. They weren't even placed on high alert because the bombing of Pearl Harbor was so unexpected. Anyways, Yoshie Shiratori was now a wanted free man after he had just now escaped from his second prison. The poor man had started to become accustomed to the beatings and the cruelty of the Japanese prison system, and he was able to escape capture for 3 months. After 3 months of contemplation, he decided that he wanted to go talk to a cop of his that was also a friend. He was hoping that when he would go and see this cop, that they would be able to combat the legal system together. When he reached his friend, he begged for the officer to help him take on the prison system inside Japan. Unfortunately, his friend was not very friendly when the police officer decided to call the cops on him and rearrest Shiratori. This cop was none other than Kobayashi himself from Akita Prison. By this time, Shiratori had become famous for his masterful ability to escape from prison. Determined to prevent future escapes, Shiratori was sentenced to go to a high-security max prison called Abashiri Prison. In the history of Abashiri, nobody has ever escaped because of how stringent the control measures are. Abashiri was located in a place that constantly sees snow, and temperatures are almost always in the winter between 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, or for everybody else, that is -12 to -9 degrees Celsius. In addition to that, he would also be provided minimal clothing so that he could not protect himself from this coldness, and there was no heating inside the cell of where he was staying. The only protection between Shiratori and the natural outside freezing winter weathers of Japan was the copper walls and the steel bars that lined between him and the outside. At the time, Abashiri Prison was one of the most notorious prisons in the world, and every time that Shiratori would stand up whenever he was not supposed to, or even inside his own cell, the guards would come in and they would beat him for no other reason than to control him or for pleasure. They fastened a custom-made handcuff for Shiratori himself just to ensure that he would not be able to pick the locks and escape from his restraints. They did this by adding layers to the lock so that it would have an even tighter fit, and this comes with the added risk of preventing circulation to the hands. Commonly, these handcuffs that were custom made for the person would not only have problems with people getting circulation cut off to their hands and fingers, it would also increase the amount of lacerations and cut that were on the insides of their wrist, which would start to grow infected. If that wasn't enough, Abashiri also decided to place ankle restraints around the bottoms of his feet so that he could not take any more step than half the width of his shoulders. Although it is not common to have ankle restraints at Abashiri prison at all times, Shiratori did have to wear them. He would wear them when he went to bed, when he woke up, when he ate, and he was not allowed to take them off. The only time he could take them off was once a week, when a specialized locksmith would come in and would spend 2 hours unlocking his restraints so that he could clean himself. Why did it take so long to remove these handcuffs, even with somebody who had the key and knew what they were doing? Well, this is because his handcuffs would be riveted to prevent them from being picked and pried apart by hand. They would be mechanically forced closed like a nail in wood. The locksmith would have to come in and remove the rivets every time that the handcuffs were to be removed. Due to how tight these cuffs were, Shiratori's hands and ankles had started to become mutilated and started getting deep lacerations and cuts around his wrists and ankles. Filled with these bruises and lacerations that I mentioned, he would never be able to have enough time for all of the cuts around him to begin to heal. And this is because every time that the healing process would start, they would be just continuously reopening the scabs due to how tight the handcuffs were. Filled with these cuts and bruises, Yoshie Shiratori would never have a chance to get his wrists and ankles to heal properly. It is claimed that the system imposed on Yoshie Shiratori is one of the most secure restraints ever used in the history of Japan. If that wasn't enough, the door that had the vent for his food to come in was shorter than the width of his shoulders so that he could not worm his way through. This was done as a final measure to ensure that even if he somehow by a miracle was able to escape from his handcuffs and ankle restraints, he would not be able to leave his cell. And as with all the prisons before this, the walls of the prison were as well lined with copper to prevent him from being able to climb. However, this does not seem to be an effective countermeasure for Shiratori. Now, to keep Shiratori in low morale, they would provide him with half bowls of miso soup and starve him. This was done to prevent him from gaining energy to begin attempting an escape. Now, how did Shiratori escape Abashiri prison and become known as the first person to ever escape Abashiri, as well as the last person to ever escape? Well, starting from the beginning, he noticed as soon as he walked in that the vent around him was already beginning to rust. This seems to be a common theme throughout all of his escapes that have happened so far. With the vent already having late stages of rust, he felt as though that he could outweigh the lifespan of the vent and he'd be able to pull the bars and separate them so that he could get through. In order to do this, he had to think of ways to speed up the process since the rust process in general is very slow. And he demonstrated his knowledge knowing that rust is just a simple chemical reaction that occurs faster under wet, salty conditions. In pure luck, it just so happens that the soup that he was being provided is the miso soup as mentioned earlier. And miso soup is both. It's high in salt and it's wet. In order to speed up this process, he began taking small portions of the miso soup that he had been given. Even though that it was only half, he would be able to separate a little bit of it and pour it directly onto the screws and around the surroundings of the vents that he needed to move from. The screws around the vent were beginning to loosen over time through the months of winter, as well as the handcuffs around him began to widen. Over a period of the winter weathering, an occasional screw would come out, and then another, until there was one screw left. And by this time, he knew that it was just a short matter of time before he was able to remove these screws and be able to escape through this vent. Now he could remove himself from the shackles that had been placed on him, but if you remember, Abashiri prison had planned for this, and they had made the vent around his door smaller than the width of his shoulders. In order to go through the vent, he realized quickly that he would have to dislocate his shoulder. With this dislocation, he was now able to worm his way all the way to his chest, and with one final exhale and one commitment, he was able to push himself through the vent, and now he was out of his cell. He crawled up the walls of Abashiri prison, and he located a broken window, which he was then able to use to climb out. This is the most famous prison escape that has ever occurred in the history of Japan. This escape was known as the miso soup escape, and this is what gave him the reputation that he has today. And in my prison, this escape beats the prison of Alcatraz. After breaking out of Abashiri prison, he now found himself in the middle of a dead cold winter in Hokkaido, Japan. The freezing wind cut through him like a blade, and with no shoes, no food, and nowhere to go, he began to rely on just his instincts for survival. Every step he had into the deep snow was a battle against hypothermia. His body was pushed close to the brink of death, and he did whatever he could to scavenge for roots, berries, or anything that could be presumed as edible. When he was desperate enough, he would sneak into farms and steal just enough to keep him alive. This is because he knew that the police were after him, and if the farmers noticed that someone was coming on to steal food, then they would report that and he would be drawing attention to himself. Now, backing up 2 weeks, there was only one person in the world who still loved Shiratori, and that was his wife. There are no records of her name, but what is known is that Shiratori and his wife had one daughter together. Because Shiratori was constantly in and escaping from prison, he never established a good relationship with his daughter. Miss Shiratori knew about Yoshie's escape and was continuously hoping that one day Shiratori himself would come home and they would be able to be a family again. Miss Shiratori had one hope left, and that would be the end of World War II. She hoped that when the war would end, Japan would no longer be focused on finding one escaped prisoner, because the United States would now be exploring Japan and establishing a new system. On August 6th and August 9th of 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Less than 1 week later, on August 15th, 11 days after Shiratori had just escaped prison, Japan surrendered. And that brings us back to the present. For months he moved like a ghost through the wilderness, dodging patrols, hiding in caves and abandoned buildings, and then eventually he settled among living in a mine. At this time, with all of the unfortunate conditions that he was under, he was doing whatever he could to survive. The more time he spent out there picking berries and being alone, he realized something. He wasn't just running anymore, he was angry. Angry at a system that had beaten him, starved him, and treated him like an animal. He couldn't let it keep happening to him. One day, he snuck out into a farm to try to steal a tomato, but unfortunately the farmer had spotted him and called the cops on Shiratori. Then, thinking that Shiratori was a thief, he ran out to confront him, and a scuffle began to occur. It's unknown as to exactly what had happened, but one thing is known for sure. Shiratori ended up killing the farmer. Shiratori never denied the murder of the farmer, which just brings into consideration on did he actually murder the woman, which he had always denied beforehand. Shiratori was caught by the Japanese police force. He was once again convicted of murder and sentenced to death in Sapporo prison, and unfortunately for his wife, he would not be forgotten by the legal system. This time he was placed in a highly secure prison cell with heavy shackles. This cell was deemed impossible to escape from. They made sure that all of the openings that surrounded him that he could possibly escape from were smaller than the width of his head, because if you can't get your head through, then no part of your body can. In addition to this, the walls of his cell were too far wide to actually reach across. In addition to these wide walls, the walls were also extremely high, with just a vent at the very top that he could not access to give him a natural sunlight. The guards were so confident in their ability to contain Shiratori in Sapporo prison that they did not shackle him at all times. Instead, there were 6 guards that were put on rotation to constantly watch Shiratori in person so that he could not do anything undetected. This did not stop him from planning his next and final escape. Every day he would look towards the sunroof that was in his prison cell, and this was done to condition the guards to think that he was thinking of an escape to go up. This was a red herring, however. He instead, using another miso soup inspired escape, would use the bowls that he had get to dig underneath the floor of his futon. See, the prison floor in Sapporo prison was made out of wood, and underneath the wood was nothing but dirt. This might be the dumbest and most obvious escape that Shiratori has ever done. I'm surprised that The entirety of Sapporo prison, including the guards and all the inmates, not one of them thought to dig through the dirt. Shiratori would pry up the wooden planks underneath his bed, and he would begin to slowly dig out the dirt that was underneath him. It's unknown as to how he was able to get rid of the dirt that was being produced while digging his tunnel. Now, as a reminder, he would begin to stare upwards towards the vent to further increase the odds of the guards thinking that he would be escaping through the roof. And with this, he would begin to act depressed, and he would not be listening to any commands that were given to him. When they told him to stand up or to line up for roll call, he would deliberately wait for them to come and get him before he would do anything. This was so that when he made his final escape by tunneling out, that when they called him, they would just think, oh, he's being lazy again. On April 1st, 1947, as one of the funniest April Fool's jokes, he just escaped his 4th prison. He managed to escape custody for about 1 year living as a normal person, without having to live in a cave or scrounge for berries to survive. He was living in the changing cities that were growing in Japan. One day, he made a trip to a local park and sat on the bench. While watching people go by, thinking about his unjust time in the Japanese prison system, a police officer came and sat down next to Shiratori. While the cop's name is not given or documented, his actions spoke loud enough to change the course of Shiratori's life. The man did something simple as offering Shiratori a cigarette, which at the time was extremely nice. The policeman did not know who Yoshie was or what actions he had done in his life, but instead the cop was just being a kind person. This changed the demeanor of Shiratori completely. He began to break down. For the first time in years, somebody had just shown Yoshie Shiratori compassion, which he had not experienced. The last time he felt kindness was with Kobayashi, the head prison guard of Akita prison, who would later betray him. After the small act of receiving the cigarette from the cop, which at the time cigarettes were deemed extremely expensive and were uncommon to bum off of, Yoshie Shiratori decided to do the unthinkable. He decided to confide in the police officer sitting next to him. He told him everything. He told him about his prison escapes and how the prison system had been wearing him down, breaking him. He told him the story about how he was unjustly convicted of the murder of a woman that started the whole thing. He had told the cop that he had been on the run for over a year after escaping Sapporo prison. Shiratori had just turned himself in, not to a cop, but to a truly kind person. In return, the cop decided to help Shiratori combat against the harsh conditions that had been inside of Japan. He was once again put on trial for all the crimes he had done. And since Japan had already started the reformation of their prison system after the end of World War II, things were looking and changing for the better. He explained to the court that the only reason he escaped from these prisons was due to the abusive conditions that he was placed under. He would explain to the court the harshness of the Japanese prison system by explaining his first-hand accounts of what had been happening to him. He talked about the beatings and the starvation and the minimal protection against the cold, harsh climates of Japan. In 1961, the court decided on many things in regards to Shiratori's life. The first and the biggest one was he was no longer convicted of the murder of the woman that had started this whole thing. The second thing was that the death of the farmer was ruled as self-defense, and Shiratori would not be held accountable for the murder of the farmer. This decision of the court was made because all the accounts of the murder of the farmer say that Yoshie Shiratori was not given a chance to defend his position or resolve things peacefully. And as a final decision, Shiratori was sentenced to 20 years in prison due to thievery and his escapes from all the prisons. He was sentenced to a prison that had a warmer climate called Fuchu Prison in Tokyo, Japan. Here in Fuchu Prison, the guards would treat the prisoners kindly and with respect. There are no records of any humiliations or beatings that occurred in Fuchu Prison at this time. Shiratori never tried to escape Fuchu Prison, and 14 years later he was released early on parole due to good behavior. When he went back home after serving for 14 years to meet his wife, he unfortunately found that his wife had passed away. He tried to reconnect with his daughter, but unfortunately, due to him being away from almost the entire life of his daughter as she grew up, they never had a close relationship, and so things didn't work out very well. They stayed distant. And now, as a free man, a true free man, Shiratori began to make an honest living for himself. He spent the rest of his life working a normal job, and there are no records of him ever turning to gambling again. In 1979, at the age of 71, Yoshie Shiratori passed away from a heart attack. His legacy has continued throughout books and movies that were inspired by his life. One example of which is called Hagoku, which translates to Prison Break, written by Akira Yoshimura. This novel that was written told the story of Yoshimura's life. A year later, it would win the Yomiuri Prize. According to the internet, the prize was founded in 1949. The Yomiuri Shimbun Company established this prize to help bring about a strong cultural nation. The winner is awarded 2 million yen and an inkstone. It was later that then the novel was now adapted into a movie. Also, as a final side note, it is mentioned that Yoshie Shiratori was the inspiration for a man or a character named Yoshitaka Shiratori, who is one of the characters in an anime called Golden Kamui. If you like to watch anime, this is one of my favorites, as long as you don't mind the occasional what the hell moment. Anyways, that's going to be it from me today. I hope you like this new style of format, and thank you so much for your time. Thank you.